I feel like so much of what tech is infused with the real life experiences of the guys who run it, who are often software developers themselves, very often. And I just think that really kind of informs their outlook on things.
Welcome to the Cut Your Learning Curve podcast. I'm your regular host, Nate Cooper, and with me this season, I have Eve McKnight as my co-host. In this season of Cut Your Learning Curve, we're sponsored by Swarm, a digital product design agency and management consultancy. Swarm helps you connect the dots and mitigate the risks associated with launching a digital product, website, or idea. Thanks for joining me, Eve. Please go ahead and introduce yourself.
Hi, I'm Eve McKnight. I teach about project management all over the United States with my company, Little Owl, and I'm also the Director of Learning here at Swarm.
Awesome. Thanks for joining me, Eve. If you're new to the podcast, Cut Your Learning Curve is where we help you rethink how you can learn new skills that benefit your professional career and the projects that you want to develop. So let's jump into the episode. So today we're talking about the value of expertise. And for most of the conversations we've been having, we've been trying to ask a question that will start the conversation. And I think we've been talking about it for a couple of days now, this topic around expertise and resilience. So I think we'll have a lot to say on this topic. But the specific question we decided to address this time is, what is the value of expertise? And we're specifically looking at job market, tech startups, the scientific method, politics, and society at large. So lots of big ideas in there. But I want to start off, maybe Eve, if you want to take the question, what is the value of expertise? And maybe you can explain kind of the context and what you were thinking about.
So thanks, Nate. So as Nate and I, we check in a little bit beforehand. So I realized this topic we come up with a topic per week and we take turns sort of who comes up with it. And this one for me was particularly valuable and interesting just because I thought it shot out in so many different directions. So starting with the sort of basic definition, what I think of expertise as is that you as an individual develop a lot of highly specialized information and knowledge about a specific area. Just as a very simple definition. Someone like Malcolm Gladwell talks about it being 10,000 hours or more to achieve sort of a mastery. I don't know if we necessarily need that number, but it's this idea that you have a great deal of sort of knowledge and experience and possibly training in one specific subject area. And so, like Nate mentioned, there definitely are a lot of areas of interest here. One that I thought was interesting to start with was sort of what expertise means in the tech field. So Nate and I both really come from tech backgrounds. We've both also been in education for quite some time. And one of the advantages, and so another way we framed this was there was a nice article that we looked at from The Atlantic called The Navy's USS Gabriel Gifford and the Future of Work, and discussing sort of where we're going and what's happening next. And so I thought this was a nice quote. The half-life of skills is getting shorter. I was told by ABM's Joanna Daly. By 2020, a 2016 World Economic Forum report predicted more than 1/3 of desired core skill sets of occupations will not have been seen as crucial to the job when the report was published. If that's the case, I asked John Sullivan, a prominent Silicon Valley talent advisor, why would anyone take time to master anything at all? You shouldn't, he replied. Now, it even talks about it in the article. It's worth taking that with sort of a grain of salt, but I would say one of the advantages of moving away from certainly hyper specialties, and I think a lot of it comes down to what you're making and sort of what your goals are, but I definitely think there's been an embrace of this in the tech space. Some examples of this would be, and again, Nate and I really do work on some of these issues, like the kind of training you see for product managers or front-end software developers or back-end software developers does not necessarily entail years and years of study. They often take relatively short programs, maybe months or shorter, and then start working in these fields. The advantages of doing this, as sort of a starting point, is something that I think is just very appealing really about tech across the board is there is a very low barrier to entry. Now, the barrier for success might be something else, but, a tech startup these days needs so little just to get started. The cost of materials is really dropped. The labor is probably your biggest cost or biggest expense. There's just not a lot of barriers. Also, specifically in the tech space, you aren't necessarily required to finish years of education and years of certification. I think that's always been something that's, in a way that's really attributable even to just the design of the internet. This idea that like information is open and free. And I do think that's one of the more attractive points on the good side when it can be, that I see as really sort of an appealing part of this world, because certainly for a long time, getting certifications, getting state approvals, federal approvals, this has often been a real reason it took much longer for various businesses and organizations to get started and to scale up as organizations. And especially on the tech side of things, you really don't see that. So I don't know, Nate, if you could speak to that from your experience.
Well, it's actually, you reminded me of sort of a running meme or joke within engineering circles, which is when people post job requirements where they say they want 10 years of experience in a particular library, and then the punchline is that like the library's only existed for 3 or 4 years. And so there is kind of a running sort of commentary, not just on the humorous quality of like how absurd it is to have 10 years of experience in something that only existed since 3 years ago, but just the idea that like time that you put in may not actually signify, how much experience you have with something, because even if the idea is like the experience might come from the depth of knowledge much more so than the amount of time that's put in. So I'm not sure how that dovetails with what you're talking about, but I was thinking a little bit about that. I mean, I even saw a recent one where this guy went in for a job interview and they rejected him for saying that he didn't have enough experience in this one iOS library. And then he said, "Joke's on them, I built the library." So there is kind of this challenge, I think, because traditional work environments do look at hours synonymous with experience. And that's not always necessarily what makes for a quality developer, somebody who's put in a certain amount of time. There certainly is an amount of time, obviously, like if you've just started yesterday, you're not going to be as good as somebody who's been doing it for years. But there is kind of it's pretty fast paced. Things shift very quickly. So just saying 5 or 10 years of experience is not necessarily the same thing as having a depth of knowledge and mastery of a particular technology product. Does that make sense?
So I hear you more from the perspective of how it's being lived. I also think it gets to, what you were just talking about, it's sort of depth of experience and knowledge. And really unlike other fields, it seems to me, I mean, I grew up with a sibling that was just such a self-learner. And I feel like I see, and we're very close in age. So going through all of school together, I'm not sure one teacher ever, in all the years we sat through school together, I'm just not sure that any teacher ever actually taught her anything. She's quiet. I think she just sat there and learned things on her own and just behaved during class, and nobody really noticed the difference. And I just feel like that's such a behavior that I see in the tech community. And I think it has to do with the nature of the kind of work they do, right? Since every problem tends to be unique, right? Coding, I mean, you can of course leverage coding libraries, but the way I explain Agile, the way I explain some of the unpredictability that we have in software work is because essentially you're solving logic problems to reach this unique end, to build this new feature, to complete this system integration, et cetera, et cetera. And it just seems to me the style of learning, the style by which knowledge is acquired is very collaborative, but it's so much less hierarchical than other fields. And I feel like so much of what tech is infused with the real life experiences of the guys who run it, who are often software developers themselves, very often. And I just think that really kind of informs their outlook on things. So the idea that some senior or higher power would certify 6 of their guys just becomes less meaningful. Now, when you look at larger tech organizations, they tend to hire HR. And in my experience, HR doesn't really know how to see anything other than these badges of years of experience or badges of certification or trainings completed, just in part because they often aren't skilled in that type of work. But
right.
I feel, and I actually feel like in a way, as somebody who feels this quite strongly, I feel like tech went out and built the world they would like to see. Particularly in terms of how software teams organize and how they build product.
Yeah, and I think that's definitely reflected in that in kind of pie in the sky, perhaps, or maybe real or not real meritocracy that is often represented within tech. maybe comes from what you just said, which is trying to build the world that they want rather than the one that exists. But I guess I think it's a real challenge. You mentioned HR, I know that I've talked to people in that world, in terms of how do you find out whether somebody is a quality engineer or whether they can do what they say they can do. And looking for objective measures can be kind of challenging. And it might be the reason why oftentimes companies will hire an engineering manager to recruit a team, because they want that engineer to actually do that heavy lifting, because they can actually translate it potentially better to the HR department. But I don't want to get too far off track. I'm just thinking in terms of expertise. Is this sort of discussion around how many hours you put in or the amount of comfort level that you have with something related to expertise, or is it not related in your mind?
Well, actually, that was and I think you just touched on it. That to me is also part of the pain point. So there's a really great piece. I remain a Kara Swisher fan, and she has a great piece in the New York Times today, how tech is really the only industry that isn't held accountable in a way that energy guys are, and the construction field certainly, and even legal, certainly medical. There's all kinds of investigations that can happen. Banking also. And one of the things that I think holds these different industries accountable is that they are starting to be, certainly from a business ownership standpoint, but that actually is not related to the product itself. That's more about how they execute their business and market share, right? So that's all sort of antitrust conversation is a little bit side. But when you really get into the weeds of the things that these guys build, I think a really nice analogy is the field of construction. We live in this huge city. Both Nate and I are here in New York City. And I think it's a really remarkable accomplishment that we have these that reach towards the mountains, skyscrapers, and they're on every block in Manhattan, and they're enormous. And, one of the reasons they never fall, unless people fly planes into them, frankly, is because of the way the foundations are built. And there are real third-party standards that have to happen, and these are evaluated, in this case, by a government agency. But, what's really valuable about that is there are these recognizable standards upon which skyscrapers are built. And, then we have a whole city of these gleaming towers. Whereas I think it's just fascinating in tech. I've had so many conversations with developers, and they could never give me a good answer around what was quality software, what is scalable software, what is stable software, and what does that mean in terms of architecture, in terms of how they design it, in terms of how they build it. Another writer, Zeynep Tufekci, she's a Turkish. She also writes at The Times and The Atlantic and a few others. She's actually broken this down very nicely in sort of layman's English, basically that to increase processing speeds and to increase the way knowledge gets retrieved, they essentially shortchange some of the scaffolding at the bottom, which makes sense. An analogy in construction for all of us non-tech people is, you shortchange the bottom so you can build a little bit more quickly and save some money. And I think it's fascinating because, again, when Amazon Web Services goes down, when Facebook crashes, when our knowledge is compromised, our information is compromised, there's no meaningful accountability in terms of really experts saying, hey, did you build according to these standards? So that, I would argue, actually is the downside of a very open interpretation to what expertise is in the first place and how we even measure it.
The downside being that we don't have a objective way of measuring it?
Yeah, third-party standards around things like safety, to say nothing of for betterment of society. There's sort of all these unintended consequences by very specific products in terms of how they affect users. That's kind of a separate issue, and that comes to product design. But certainly in terms of hey, is this software stable? Is it secure? Can it be hacked? And what do all those questions mean? And at this moment, that is a completely unregulated private industry conversation. And it's interesting to me, given the number of developers I talk to, how I've never ever heard of here's one recognizable set of standards for what quality is. And then I think that actually comes back to getting to expertise, what makes for a good developer, to answer your question.
Well, I'm trying to think if this is a devil's advocate position or not, but I definitely have encountered kind of the opposite point of view because, there are definitely standards in the world of tech. There are international nonprofit organizations, mainly organized under the IEEE, that govern engineering standards. And like especially in the world of web where I live, the World Wide Web is governed by those standards. You can argue that maybe the governments should have more of a say in it, but I mean they do. IEEE standards are followed by, it is a non-governmental organization, but it is something that's followed by governments. And the thing I was thinking about what you're talking about is that, like, I find frankly that, like, it's really hard to explain any of that. Like, no one frankly cares. I would say, I don't want to say no one cares. That's definitely unfair. But what I mean is that, like, when you do get into the weeds of it, because I think from an engineering standpoint, there is definitely kind of a structure that exists to govern some of these things around security, around standardization, around like best practices, things like that. But when you actually try to say that from my perspective, like a sales perspective, talking to a client, they honestly don't care. And the reason why is because it's something they don't understand, and it costs more. So it's actually the market in some ways that's kind of pushing us in some ways outside of that, and not to say it's inscrutable, and I mean, definitely, like, the World Wide Web Consortium, even though it has noble causes and a noble founder, has been co-opted by some of these bigger companies, or at least they are big influencers within it. But I was just thinking of an example I had a little while ago with a client where we were working with their legal team, and they were trying to say, we want the website to be ADA compliant. And we were telling them that there is no ADA compliance standards for web. There is an international standard for how do you make a website accessible, and the ADA recommends that you follow those standards.
You mean American Disability Act?
Correct,
right?
The American Disability Act. Because, I mean, that's an important thing. For example, I mean, I'm taking kind of a slice of what you're saying, but that's something where it's like, all technology should be accessible. And it's weird to me because I ended up having to do more sort of like legal research to wrap my head around it. And at the end of the day, the client, I wouldn't say that, I was kind of saying the client didn't care, but they kind of just want to hear, yes, you'll do it, but not understanding the complexities of, like, hey, we're engineers, not lawyers. Like, that's not necessarily on us. Like, if your legal department wants to do this, you should do it. That's your prerogative. And it's ended up coming to a good kind of resolution, but it was really interesting to me because it was like we were trying to be advocates for, like, hey, look, we know we're not the best people to decide on this, but you're making us decide on it, and to be the experts in that realm, even though, like, technically, like, American Disabilities Act is not at all a technical requirement. It is something that influences a lot of, I mean, for example, engineering, like architecture, like it gives guidelines, for example, that sort of thing. But it's not necessarily, it doesn't go deep enough for someone who's developing a website. And that's where it's like, for me, I've really experienced it from the point of view of, like I said, the clients kind of throw it on us and expect us to be the lawyers to kind of like come up with it. And they don't necessarily want to pay extra because it's a lot of work to actually make something accessible and to follow the guidelines and, to actually know what you're doing,
I hear you there. And at least, I feel like, though, if you getting back to the construction analogy, right? Like, there's some fairly clear ways you can see ADA. For example, like you build a ramp instead of stairs, right? So, and something I certainly see a lot as somebody who's spent time in this space like you do, and because Nate and I have a lot of conversations about that, is yes, when things are abstract and you can't touch it, which is really all of software except demos, people just check out. They just have no idea what you're talking about.
Right.
And also, again, when you make software, you build something, you break something else. It is a non-linear process. It is not the same as building a skyscraper where you build the basement and then you build the top floor. Like, it just doesn't work that way. So I do think that, I guess what I was talking about is, I come more from mobile, and I certainly have heard about sort of HTML5 standards, and I know there are some conditions around the World Wide Web, and I also know that's another reason why it tends to function well in many, many governments and environments and countries all over the world. And I know there are closer to standards, but it was just always interesting to me building. So we had a core code base, and then we would build apps off it for various clients, with the idea being that updates to the core code base would then support specific specialized apps. Essentially plug and play. We just swapped out content and put in different features based on our core code base. So every time we updated the base, it would sync seamlessly with all of these products that we had built for clients, right? Which requires a lot of real vision. because then you can't do too customized for any client. So you really have to live very tightly within the product roadmap, and you can really only give people a very specific set of products and absolutely that set of features. And that's something we looked at a lot. But what was always interesting to me working with front-end developers and JavaScript developers and our CTO was I just could never get a handle on what were some basic standards in terms of actually building out this product, in terms of it being stable enough that we could push it out on all these different platforms and it would just work, and all these specialized products, and then also the core code base, with the idea being at some point we would license the core code base, which was sort of where they ended up going, where they did. And that's just always been a fascinating experience to me. And then, getting back to expertise, because that's really our focus here, in terms of how do you evaluate developers, in addition to there not being third-party evaluations, simply, I actually believe the reason they assumed you could do the ADA thing was they just assumed that that's already been set up, that somebody somewhere has published a white paper on what does ADA compliance mean for web development, right? I think they just assumed that. Or really didn't care one way or the other. And there's actually been, huge amounts written about ADA compliance and skyscrapers. It's very well documented. I think that's actually another example of how, because people see external standards in basically every other industry, they just kind of assume it exists for us. And then when you see everything from websites crashing constantly to, worldwide breaches, and I think there's certainly some warning, and there's actually in some of the very large scale hacking, there is often a paper trail of a technology firm saying, we think your software is out of date, here's what you need to pay to replace it, and them not doing it. So it comes from both sides. But it's just an interesting thing to me, just to get back to that original point about what does it even mean to be an expert in that whole field.
The article that kind of sparked this was the one in the Atlantic that you sent me, the at work expertise is falling out of favor. And I thought it was quite interesting that it was profiling like a Navy ship as kind of the metaphor for this. There's several points that were really interesting about just using like the Navy as kind of the example of this was really interesting for me. But one thing that you were just talking about that reminded me of one of the thoughts I had was, the internet itself was created by the armed forces. I'm trying to remember, it wasn't the Navy, I think it was the Army, but I could be wrong on that. The idea of a distributed network, though, was specifically to address security concerns, because what they wanted to do was set up a situation like a traditional network. If you have a hub and spoke thing, if you take out the hub, all of the pieces are now disconnected. Whereas if you have a distributed network where each node is kind of able to route things independently, if you're imagining like a grid of road networks, if a bridge goes out and there are other bridges, you just reroute the traffic over the other bridge. And the reason why the Army invented the internet, or really the network that became the internet, in a distributed fashion, was to protect against nuclear attacks, so that if a city was blown up, that connectivity still worked across the US. And what I think is inherent when you start to build things in a distributed fashion is that it is necessarily non-hierarchical, like by definition, and therefore it sort of is built in a way to kind of handle changes or to reroute things necessarily, rather than privilege one thing over another. Because if you do say, okay, well, we're going to route everything through the central thing, you take out the central thing and now everything breaks. And so sort of because of this structure that was set up for the internet, I think it inherently sort of bled into that approach for all of the architecture that's built on top of it. And so a lot of these engineering and technology pieces we're talking about in terms of like not being able to really understand why one way is better than another is because there's often multiple ways of doing it. And there are, known unknowns and unknown unknowns. And it's basically like that you're setting things up for learning how to find out your unknowns in a lot of cases. And it's, I think, very inherently grows out of that, the nature of how the whole system was set up in the first place. Is like it was sort of inherently set up to be non-hierarchical, and therefore it's so complex that even somebody who would be an expert knows that they don't know everything, knows that they can't know every possible ramification of it. Do you know what I mean?
I've definitely heard this before, the second part,
yeah.
that there's literally no one who knows end to end everything about technology today. There's no one. It doesn't exist. So I strongly agree with that point. And I think and I'd also say, I thought it was DARPA that invented the internet, but I'm not sure.
That's a defense. It's comes from, DARPA is like defense something.
Yeah, that's right. I was thinking the same thing. But also, my understanding, I'm not sure I know as much about clouds today, but my understanding actually that Microsoft's big play and the reason actually they've really been able to turn around their revenue is this is what they do now, is they take large organizations and they distribute all of their information and stored information in the cloud, and then they use AI and all of their business functions to analyze the information and provide value to the organizations. And that's actually been their big shift as one of the largest tech companies in the world. So I think there is actually now playing out in the private sector a basic version of what you just said with regards to I'm a big company and I have all this data. Where am I going to store it? It's safer for me to do it in a distributed network on the cloud than having it in one server in my basement or four servers.
And the internet is a distributed network. So, it was the Defense Department and it was the Defense Advanced Research Project Agency. Is DARPA. So
well, yeah, and I think that's actually where business is moving today in terms of their own resources to protect them. And then I thought what was really interesting is, so you're saying, it brought about this hierarchy. I would actually argue it's chicken and egg, because what's always been striking to me is the kind of people attracted to this kind of work and who want to spend their time building out a distributed system tend to be people who do not enjoy hierarchies to begin with. There's
absolutely.
that real stream of libertarianism that really today lives in San Francisco and lives on the internet. And I always think it's so interesting as more of a liberal arts person, how much these business decisions are colored by personal experience and lots of political attitudes that existed long before these people even got into tech. So, I think, yes, it's sort of a meeting of both. Like, it's a bunch of people that believe distributed information or distributed networks was just the better way to go. But they also believe that in terms of power and systems. You know what I'm saying?
Yeah, no,
So
definitely.
I can see how it all reinforces each other.
Yeah, for sure. And I mean, I know Richard Stallman has gone through his own Me Too moment, so I don't know where he is, and I'm not necessarily advocating one way or the other, but he is the inventor of the Free Software Foundation and essentially what open source software is. And he came about that from being an engineer at MIT in the 70s and then being really upset when companies in the 70s started to lock down their software. And if you had sort of a dichotomy that you were putting things on a spectrum of things, for example, like on the other end you have a Bill Gates who was one of the first people to argue that you should close down your source code. It's the only way, in his opinion, back in this early paper, of making any money off of this, is that you have to make sure that things are closed down. And the reason why I thought of this is that this sort of the open source sort of approach is that distributed approach. It's this idea that you make the code itself available, because if you get a hive mind working on it, and you don't necessarily have to think about, how do we sort of plan everything out from beginning to end, looking at, this is where A is, and we want to get to C at this timeline. This person is doing this and this person is doing that. Instead, you kind of just say, well, we are at A and we want to get to C. And anybody who wants to do it, here's A, figure out how best to get to C, and then you have a lot of different types of input. I mean, you could see the influence on that on Wikipedia.
I was literally just thinking of Wikipedia as you said that.
Yeah.
Right.
Yeah.
I know, just to keep moving too. So another point that was made in the article that Nate and I have both referenced was what they premise, which I don't know if I really believe, is the risk with when you're too far into expertise or rely too far on it is you become much less, first of all, they talk about in the article, is this failure to inspect their knowledge structure for signs of decay. And also this ability to respond in real time to changing situations, to adaptability. And I think that's an interesting argument. Certainly all of Agile is this whole idea, again, about the capacity to respond to change. I don't know if I really believe it, that it's one or the other. But I do think the ability to respond to change and the ability to self-examine what we know, which is actually, I believe, where we started and what Nate's been mentioning a few times in the very construct of how software is built and the kinds of problems that are solved. Every time you're looking at the layer and reevaluating, is this going to work? right?
Right.
So
Yeah.
I think it's such an integral part of it.
Yeah, for sure. I mean, just what you just said now too reminded me of the Dunning-Kruger effect. Did they reference that in the article?
No, I don't think so.
It's like, I'm looking at the Wikipedia, so I don't know this off the top of my head, but it's a cognitive bias in which people with low ability to task tend to overestimate their ability. So the idea is that, like, and I think the manifest of that, and I think this is maybe the argument for why we should sort of look towards experts, is that you look at something like Twitter, where everybody's got an opinion and they think they have the right way of doing it, and it necessarily drowns out people who are experts on a particular subject, because people who are experts tend to have sort of the opposite bias. So people who are less knowledgeable about something tend to overestimate how good they are at it, or how well they understand it. People who are more knowledgeable tend to underestimate. And so the people who are experts, who should be the ones that are speaking out more on it, tend to actually cut themselves short more often than those people who know less about something and drown out much of the experts, which I think is, if you relate to kind of our current environment with like mask wearing and science and Fauci and all this stuff, I mean, a really interesting sort of debate about what happens when you kind of just let the wolves loose and everybody's shouting at each other.
Yeah, I mean, it's so fascinating. There's so many trends that are sort of happening from very different directions. I think for tech, their frankly dislike of big fancy titles and certification and training and a bunch of stuff that historically, and also I think limited access to markets, right? Like it used to be you had to go to college and only really a certain percentage of the population went to college, and it wasn't very diverse. And that's really changing. That is really changing, with caveats. But, you know, and that was actually the last issue I really was hoping we'd get to today, is what about what's happening exactly in this political frame of people wholeheartedly just disregarding experts. You know, another thing they talk about in the article is, for them, the definition of adaptability is the ability to see evidence and respond accordingly. And their argument is that experts can't always do that. But like certainly what we're seeing in this disregard of actual experts in the science field is having very real ramifications on public health.
Right.
So it's from like a totally different direction. And, you know, Nate and I are both in the education space, and we've mentioned in other podcasts before, like there's a lot of people out on the internet proclaiming themselves as experts on pretty much anything. And what is the definition of their expertise is a couple testimonials and some nice headshots, and that's it. And I find that concerning, especially in an era where if you're going to have regulations, which is really paramount to living in a first world country, a developed nation, you know, they do rely on expert evidence and scientific method and all of these things. And there is this growing population that just disagrees with that. And I don't have a solution for that, but I do, you know, you can see pretty clearly the real damage it does in terms of public health.
Yeah. There's a lot there.
Yeah.
I think we've already identified, even before we started, that we probably have a lot of different sort of directions to take this. So I think this is just the beginning of the conversation, but maybe we should wrap it there for today. Eve, do you want to let people know how they can find you?
Sure. I have a Facebook page with my latest classes, facebook.com/little owl with a 1 on the end. And if you just check events, I teach worldwide thanks to the World Wide Web.
Awesome. And I'm at Nate Cooper on Twitter. Thank you guys for listening, and see you next time.
Thanks for tuning in to learn with us today. This has been the Cut Your Learning Curve podcast, sponsored by Swarm. Don't forget to go to swarmnyc.com/learn. There you can sign up for our email newsletter and connect with us on social media.
Thanks, Eve. And again, my name is Nate Cooper. Thank you for listening. I hope you have a great day and happy learning.